Hello everyone. So I'm going to do something slightly different today, which is talk about something that I've been mulling over for a while, but for which my ideas are really far from being solidified, particularly because there's a component of it that I am kind of copped onto like literally yesterday. So experimentation happening here in terms of what the heck I'm doing with this video. But the topic at hand is my card of the year, or cards of the year. So part of the reason I say cards is that last year, my card of the year, according to the sort of usual birthday way of calculating things, was the Chariot. And I kept that in mind throughout the year. And to be honest, never quite figured out what the heck I was doing with this whole Chariot notion. It's a card that I think in particular because I've been in autistic burnout, was going to kind of trigger me / confuse me anyway. But it's also a card that I've never fully understood what the heck I think about it, or, you know, I can read with it and so on, and I can be more objective about it, but when I then try to turn around and do a bit of a deep dive in terms of my own opinions and my own life experiences as related to the Chariot card, I have often struggled. It's just not been the most automatic understanding. I suppose I'll put it like that. But last year I took it to heart in this way that ended up actually leading to a lot of crashes. Now those crashes were not necessarily fruitless. They were actually really useful in observing what the patterns were and getting a sense of like, okay, well, that didn't work and that didn't work and that didn't work, what does? But at the end of the year, I was still kind of thinking, I don't think I did this right, as it were. And what I mean by that is that it felt very much as though I was all go and no element of reining things in or controlling things. And I was really struggling to understand this notion of forward motion and like why that wasn't working for me, why I kept coming to a standstill, why everything was very stop-start. And I started to think about shadow relationships with cards a lot, and you know, there's been a few videos going around recently. I know Mixtress Ray has mentioned concepts around shadow work and how, like, if you're not ready to do it, you won't be doing it. You don't need to do it. You don't have to do it. Coming to that place of readiness is part of the point, is part of the excavation of shadow, because you can get there early, but you're not going to necessarily, you know, before you're ready. But you're not necessarily going to understand the content you dig up, for example. So what I ended up kind of thinking about was, okay, well, what are some of the calculations for the year card? Which isn't to say that I place my beliefs in the exact calculations themselves. I was more thinking, since I started out this way, why don't I investigate those methods a bit further? And I used another method. One includes the year of your birth and the other does not. It's just your month and day kind of scenario. So I used another method and the result came out as temperance, which really interested me. And I started thinking to myself, under what circumstances might you consider temperance to be the shadow of the Chariot? Forward motion being very necessary, something that is actually working better, at least so far this year, based on some of the things I learned about myself last year. But forward motion with that sense of moderation, that's the element that is the control in bringing these elements together almost with brute force, but with a very, very strong sense of self, strong core, whatever it is, in order to have that forward motion. So it's temperance almost at the wheel, or at the reins, or temperance is the element that allows you to amalgamate the two horses, or whatever else, the two sphinxes. And I found that really interesting. You know, we have a very, very positive view of temperance, but again, I think, like, you know, what's the shadow side of a shadow? Is it something continually negative? Is it something we normally understand as positive? There are a lot of different instances of this that I've just wondered about recently, and I did wonder, in just a very sort of meandering kind of way, not even as a critique at all. For example, just with Kellyanne's recent video on the sort of cultural fear around aging and nuancing that. I did think it was very interesting that the video overall was mostly about the fear of aging and nuancing that and discussing that as a cultural phenomenon, which is a perfectly valid topic, because it wasn't a video about aging, it was a video about fear of aging. So in a video about fear of aging, would the shadow element potentially be whether intentional, like if it's intentional, it doesn't matter as much, but like if there's an unintentional non-discussion, not like a discussion not happening about the benefits of aging, is aging still the shadow? Or is it, for example, our understanding of youth that is the shadow? Is it our more like culturally shared, fairly singular, pressurized way of looking at youth that's the issue rather than aging? So again, not actually relevant per se to what she was talking about in that video, and certainly not a critique of her video. It was more just, it got me thinking on the topic, and I was like, so what's the shadow side? What are the shadow sides of the overall topic of fear of aging? Is it aging, or is it being very young? When is the shadow side of something actually a card that's really positive? Because again, we often talk about these negative cards having positive interpretations. There's no such thing as a negative card, but does that not indicate that there's no such thing as a unanimously positive card? Possibly. It depends on who you are and what your circumstances are and how you read, I suppose. So taking that into consideration for this year, I've also really been enjoying Kelly Bear's discussions around creativity, pacing oneself, working with your physical body, doing more by doing less, understanding that rest is what's going to give you that sense of moderation, so that when you can move forward, you do so with efficiency rather than with that scattered push-pull. Okay, sometimes I dart forward and all of a sudden for weeks on end I'm completely incapacitated because I failed to rest, I failed to mitigate my energy bursts, I failed to moderate that. And I'm using the word fail quite a lot, which seems a bit charged, but you get the idea. So this year, my card, according to that first calculation method, is strength. And considering I use multiple systems, I also was thinking, therefore, it might be justice as well. Strength, justice. And then using the other calculation system, the shadow card, in this case it would be 3 cards because we have strength, justice, and then a third for the other calculation method. It's the devil. And I love that. I'm very excited about that. It makes a nice, neat tripod, a solid plane on which to function. And it is all sorts of exactly how my brain works. So I'll give a few examples. And I'll show cutaways of cards and things like that, so it's not just me sitting here like a total noodle talking at you. But I've been reading a bunch lately in various academic works, which I may also show cutaways of. I'll certainly discuss on my blog soon because I have whole things I want to kind of talk about with this. But I've been reading these various academic works on medieval magic. How that's different from witchcraft, understandings of historical witchcraft, and so on and so forth, but also the ways in which various aspects of medieval culture in specific areas plays into our understanding now, but also what we research from a historical standpoint of those time periods. I've also been listening to some podcasts, more particularly on medieval women, not so much relevant to magic, but more just culturally. So there were 2 recent podcasts from the medieval podcast, from the 5-Minute Medievalist, but the medieval podcast on women. One was to do with women's work in particular cities in Iberia, medieval Iberia, parts of what is now Spain, but also other regions. Another, and that was across religious divides as well. Another podcast was about the wife of Bath, and investigating to what degree she's a really, really useful, multifaceted, non-saintly, like as in non-overly attributed with virtue, figure from the Middle Ages. So to what degree is she accurately representing different types of women over time? and a whole discussion around a lot of the tropes and problematic narratives around her, especially as people continue to respond to her over the centuries. And then there's also a really amazing podcast that I listened to recently from In Our Time on Christine de Pizan and her effectively literary, almost novel work on titled The City of Ladies. So again, links will all be in the description, and I'm going to be exploring these like properly rather than just mentioning them in a blog post at some point. But one of the things there were two things that were mentioned, particularly in the Wife of Bath podcast, but it resonated elsewhere in a lot of these different discussions. That we have, first of all, that the Wife of Bath's story that her tale, as it were, in Canterbury Tales, that we have is the narrative motif of the Loathly Lady. Now, hers in particular goes in a particular direction. It has certain plot narratives that would be potentially a content or trigger warning for some people. So I won't go into that here more specifically, because the relevant part for me at this time, for this exploration, is that motif of the Loathly Lady. It's something that shows up in folk songs, traditional songs, medieval ballads, and so on. It was definitely, it had its variations at the time. People would have been familiar with the story. Again, actually the movie Shrek is kind of based on this narrative motif. So it has to do with sometimes she's an ogre, sometimes she's an old woman, basically to some degree or other, an aged and or grotesque, hugely ugly, very, very physically different woman, sometimes very much supernaturally so, demanding things or expressing her needs and wants at someone. In some instances of this story, it's in order to break a curse that's been placed on her and so on. And to the degree that the male figure, sometimes it's a king, sometimes it's a knight, etc., acquiesces to her requests and grants her wishes and listens to her and obeys her commands, which in some versions of the story are quite horrific.
Oh, you sew up your horse's hide and bring a drink to me. And he sewn up the bloody hide and a pipe of wine put in. And she drank it up all in one drop, left never a drop therein.
She is liberated from this curse, and there's this kind of marital union, often very sexual, that occurs. And for me, this bears a lot of resemblance as well to Ashling poetry and motifs around Macha and the Morrigan, certain mythological stories, certain sort of more legend-esque status stories around like the old hag, the crone who offers who offers sovereignty in exchange for sexual union and other such delightful activities. It's one of my favorite motifs of all time, but I had forgotten that this was relevant also to the Wife of Bath, and in some ways even forgotten just how much of a medieval motif it is, even though I knew that. So furthermore, the podcast then mentioned the Wife of Bath in her prologue referring to who painted the lion, which is a reference to effectively Aesop's fables, but a fable that was used to as like sort of teaching material in the Middle Ages, wherein a man and a lion are arguing about who is better, and a man points, in the Middle Ages it's a painting, in other versions it's a statue. The man points to a painting of a man besting a lion, about to kill it, and saying, look, isn't this amazing? Man is better than lion, he's besting the lion, and the lion basically says, if a lion had painted that, you would have a different story pictured. Who painted the lion? It's the man. Now, what does all of this have to do with tarot and the cards of the year? Well, I was thinking, therefore, about this notion of the strength card, which especially in more modern systems, up to the present day, is much more commonly known to show a woman and a lion. And I've covered on this channel before, for example, there's the famous Dürer engraving that shows Samson rending the lion, and we know that the various, for example, Visconti Sforza type decks depict a man attacking a lion with a club. So we have this transition between the card of strength being a loose, like, you know, generally a historically identified male figure attacking the lion in a violent manner, to at some point it becoming a woman, and then on top of that, extending tenderness to the lion. And to me, in listening to this podcast and hearing these themes crop up and remembering various things about them and recognizing that bit and that bit, I was suddenly going, oh my goodness, the Strength card is asking the question over time, who painted the lion? So who is the lion, who is the woman, and who painted the lion? Like, what perspective do we have here? Because part of the purpose of that fable is, for example, to argue against an overly anthropomorphic understanding of the world, but also to argue against someone. There are other iterations of these stories. I think there's another fable with a fox and a monkey, but the idea being that it's easy to make an argument against someone who has no voice. There is no voice for women in this context about this particular argument in The Wife of Bath, so she says, who painted the lion? Women don't have a voice in this capacity. We need to be able to question that. It's not an argument if no one gets to argue back at you. If you take away the voice of another person, that does not make your argument sound. And what I'm hoping to illustrate as I mention this is that that's also interesting to me about this justice card, about the fair and balanced nature of justice, often very, very neutral and indifferent, almost cruelly so, if we take it on a super more like cosmic level. But fundamentally, it's almost like, again, the other side of the Strength card is justice. Is justice the part that enacts upon the Strength card this question of who painted the lion? Who is the architect of this story? Who's left out? Who's being put in over time in favor of something else? Like, this asks narrative questions, not only of the history of tarot and of art and all these things, but also of the systems we use in the present day, regardless of history. And I think it's therefore really interesting that systems seemingly disagree about which card occupies what space, strength or justice. So to bring the devil into this, which I particularly enjoy, is, to me, the devil in this scenario represents shadow. But as I was saying earlier, where it's like, what's the shadow side of a shadow? It's maybe just more blind spots, maybe deeper blind spots. Really, really going down into the abyss of your blind spots, or the things you don't want to face, or the things you really don't like, or the things you're aware of but that you're pushing away. The shadow side of those shadows is similar to how we're looking at the flip side of a coin that is either strength or justice. So it's there to represent this kind of multi-sided coin phenomenon that I'm trying to achieve in having multiple cards of the year, as it were. But it's also there to represent the sort of rebellious witchcraft nature, that element that, again, for example, does get ascribed in certain arguments to the Wife of Bath and other medieval women, that element of the alluringness of cisgendered women over time, the tropes around them, the way you're either saint, virgin, or absolute, I don't know, harlot, whatever word we want to use, none of which I agree with. The dichotomization of good things versus bad things being very much along sexual lines, although there is an argument to be made that sort of indicates that medieval women would have been a little bit more able to talk about sex. In the Middle Ages, the discussion around sexual relations is a bit more loose and open, and we have the Victorians in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century to thank for a lot of our discomfort around those topics. But yeah, so then creatively, I find that this sort of stable base of a triangle, or the plane that those 3 points create, is giving me a lot of material to work with, and also providing me with direction for my own movement this year, my own creative endeavors, taking care of my health, whatever it happens to be. So yeah, these thoughts are all really, really poorly formulated still. They're really only just taking off. They're really only just solidifying themselves. The point for me, therefore, is to take the whole year to do it. And I'm really, really excited about that. I think there's this whole lesson that I've learned about the lack of temperance in my understanding of the Chariot, for example. Last year has given me something to work with in terms of regulating my understanding this year, taking time to do that, and being much more intentional about it from the start. really bringing in a change in perspective, among other things. But also a willingness to change the perspective again, as and when that becomes necessary. And it's really providing a lot of fuel for my own creative endeavors. As I've kind of indicated already, a lot of what I'm kind of interested in and doing this year is very sort of medieval relevant, as it always is, but it's also very much sort of historical witchcraft relevant, or historical like understandings around familiars. I'm bringing in some aspects of chaos magic into this. There's a lot of very demon and demonology and demon-esque stuff going on with relation to my own imaginative journey, my own witchcraft, and my own sort of astral sense of self this year. I've also been really, really interested in the way in which, something I'm still in the process of exploring, is the way in which medieval magic, historical concepts around medieval magic are actually different in Celtic speaking areas, and in specific ways and so on. So again, there's this recurring thing of outside systems, but with awareness of those systems. Being outside the system doesn't actually hold meaning if you don't know what component you are outside of, what you are rejecting, but also what you're responding to, not just rejecting. Anyway, I think I'm waffling at this point, but hopefully I'll have shown some useful cutaways during this video process. My camera's been complaining at me for the last few minutes, so I think I'll leave it there and try to be okay with the fact that this feels comparatively loosey-goosey and unfinished and unstructured. But yeah, so more to come on the blog about this. And again, like I said, I will link all podcasts in the description, but there will also be more discussion about that ongoing thought process on the blog. So everything kind of introduced here is going to be worked out occasionally in video format, but in sort of more bite-sized, return-toable installments over on my website, as in when it also then informs the art stuff that I'm working on, the art magic. Okay, that's enough for now. I hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
And I say, hello, Satan, I believe it is time to go. Me and the devil walking side by side, and I'm gonna see my man until I get satisfied.